Good morning. Today I'll be talking to you about Australian literature, which is one of our optional courses in the MA English program. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you that Australian literature is a very new area of study, and it comes under the umbrella term post-colonial literatures. Now, Africa, Australia, the Caribbean, Canada, and India were all colonized by the British at some point of time or the other, and the reasons behind colonization were very different. In the case of India, it was trade and commerce. In the case of Australia, it was the overcrowded prisons in England. The prisons in England were overcrowded and they didn't have a place to send their convicts to. So Australia was largely set up as a penal colony to deport their convicts. Now that I've mentioned the term post-colonial literatures, let me tell you a little something about post-colonial studies. Post-colonial studies is important because we as students and scholars of literature have felt the need to explore the influence of colonization on the history, the society, and the education, the writing of and in the colonized countries. Now, what also happened, particularly in the case of India, was that the entire English studies was a deliberate program to create colonial subjects who would identify and believe in and follow colonial norms and values. And even after independence, it was felt that the choice of books and the points of view taught in English literature continued the same kind of mental colonization. Now, this was felt not only in the case of India, but also across the world. And that's why we have prominent people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and our own Namvar Singh writing essays on decolonizing the mind. So the syllabi was obviously questioned and revised, and then when it was revised, it included a wide range of writings in English, not just English literature. Now in Australia, what was happening was that the Australians began questioning the literature programs that focused on British literature. And this was happening around the 1920s and the 1930s. And during this period, Australian literature developed as a result of trying to cut loose from the British colonial influence. Now, why we study Australian literature as Indian students is because, one, it is a questioning of the traditional focus on British literature. Two, it includes a criticism of the politics and some of the problems with categories such as post-colonial and Commonwealth literature. And three, it makes us aware of a body of writing that reveals interesting past struggles of its own. Now, not just that, the reasons are also that we can use Australian literature to compare and contrast other literatures from post-colonial countries. And we can use Australian literature to study what it means for countries to be post-colonial within quotes, and to see how this affects the whole culture and body of writing that emerges from these hitherto colonized countries. And it is also important as it helps develop a social, political, historical and cultural awareness of Australia. Now, today what I hope to do is introduce you to Australian literature and to tell you about the important themes and concerns in this literature that reflects the way Australian society and culture has been formed and shaped, especially over the last 200 years. Now, basically the themes are continuously changing, and these changes in themes will reveal the various aspects that have gone into the making of what we may now call the Australian identity and the Australian national consciousness. Some of the themes that I wish to touch upon will be those of, one, the physical landscape, and the early settlers coming to terms with it. Now, this was a very, very crucial theme that lots of people wrote about, because in a sense, when the white settlers came to Australia, they found that the climatic conditions, the landscape, the flora and the fauna were very, very different from what they were used to in the mother country, or England. For instance, when you have peak summers in the northern hemisphere in the months of May, June and July, what happens in Australia is at that moment they're going through their peak winters. And then again, instead of trees shedding leaves like they do in the northern hemisphere in autumn, you have trees shedding their barks in Australia. And then you have strange animals in Australia which are not to be found anywhere else in the world. And the second theme is the theme of midship, which was to develop as a result of lonely farm workers, or swagmen as they are called in Australian idiom, as they went about the outbacks or the vast Australian interiors, and the kind of relationship they developed with each other. Now this obviously was a very, very male-centric and male-oriented kind of a relationship. And the third theme would be the differences between city life and the bush culture. And then the fourth theme would be the tragic interaction between the original inhabitants of the land, or the Aboriginal people, and the new white settlers, the experiences of the later immigrants from Europe as well as Asia, and also the experience of women from different communities in Australia. We will also look at Australian literature in terms of the land, its history, its people, and its culture. Now, what does the term Australian literature mean? Okay, now, how do we define Australian literature? It's not easy to define Australian literature because it is connected to the problem of giving clear definitions to terms like literature as well as Australian. Now, even if you take these two terms separately, it's very difficult to define literature. What is literature? What constitutes literature? Similarly, it is equally difficult to define what is Australian. And when you take the terms together as in Australian literature, the problem gets compounded. And why this happens is largely because the meanings of these terms keep changing with time and with different contexts. Now, usually people assume and take it for granted that literature should be studied with the nation as a primary context and framework of reference. This is the kind of line of thinking that Bruce Bennett and Jennifer Strauss adopt. And they say that this happens because the nature and themes of literature are influenced by, and they also influence in turn, contemporary social and political realities. The nation, therefore, is seen as a unit in social, political, cultural, and historical terms, and the study of literature is intrinsically linked to it. Now, the study of a nation's literature is therefore deeply related to the way national identity is created and presented. Okay, and the nature of both the nation as well as the literary storytelling or the narration is connected to it, and therefore it is constantly changing. And the definition and content of both the nation and its literature change, as I said before, as social and political conditions change. Now, Jennifer Strauss and Bruce Bennett also say that the images of the country include many things, such as images from an Aboriginal dreaming, describing how the world came into existence according to Aboriginal folklore. Then there are also experiences recorded by early settlers, the first lot of settlers or the pioneers who came to Australia. And for some of them, it was a paradise on earth. Australia was a paradise. For some, it was hell. So you have experiences ranging between these two extremes of paradise as well as hell. Now, these days, literature also reveals shifts. Now, what I must also tell you is initially, Australia had a very strong white policy, which meant that people of non-European descent could not settle in Australia permanently. So they wanted to cultivate such an image for Australia, and Australia was what was also called as White Australia. But these days, especially after World War II, what happened was there was several waves of immigration to Australia from Southern Europe and Asia as well. So you have different ethnic groups now living in Australia, and Australia has now become has now begun to think of itself more as a part of Asia than it used to earlier. And what we have now is multiculturalism in Australia. So the recent literature also reflects this change from white Australia to a multicultural Australia. Now, Australia had also been occupied for several thousands of years before British invasion and eventual colonization of the island continent. Now, what also happens is that this past of Australia being inhabited way before the white settlers came in is often hidden. When Australian history and literature is presented as having its beginnings only in the past 200 odd years during which the colonizers have been there. Now, this has happened as a result of the misinterpretation of Australia as terra nullius, which means empty land. When Captain Cook first landed in Australia, he decided that Australia was terra nullius, or empty land, for the simple reason that all he encountered were the Aboriginals, who to him were primitive savages, who wore very little or no clothing at all, who had no concept of building homesteads, who had no concept of fencing off their property. So there were literally no property markers of any sort. So obviously the land to them was terra nullius, or empty land. Such a presentation that did away with the culture, civilization, and contribution of the Aborigines left the Aborigines on the margins of all discussions of Australia as a nation. But now what is happening is that the Aborigines are telling their own stories and histories of the nation. They are also laying claim to legal possession of the land. And then we also have the immigrants who are producing histories and their own literatures. Now, all these versions question the traditional concept of the Australian nation as created by the white colonizers. So now all this goes to prove what I just told you earlier, that the concept of a nation, the concept of literature, the concept of what is Australian changes over a period of time and with different contexts. And what this is doing in literature is making us take a relook at what has always been considered as, in quotes, Australian literature. Then within traditional white Australian literature also, the idea of what constituted Australianness of Australian literature was a point of debate. What is the Australianness in Australian literature was a big question. Now, why did this happen? Because people tried to define both for themselves as well as for others the nature of their political, their social, cultural, and literary relationship with the mother country. Okay? Now, in the early years of the 20th century, there were two streams of thought. One school of thought argued that truly great literature had to follow the rules, the norms, and traditions of the literary models of British and European literatures. Why? Because they were universal and eternal. And the second school of thought argued that the distinctive features of Australian literature should express the tendency to define Australia without using Britain as a reference point or as a model. So you had two different schools of thought. Now, what we have to keep in mind also is the fact that all nations attempt to tell their stories through their literature and history, and the nature of the identity that a nation wishes to present. It kind of defines the standards that will help you decide what is valuable, what is authentic within those literary and historical perspectives and representations. And the question of who will read this literature, who are you writing for, will also determine both the tone as well as the content of the literature. So, for example, when a white writer of European descent wrote, he would obviously have the metropolitan centers of Britain and Europe in mind. So what would they be writing about? They would emphasize the exotic and the bizarre in Australia. For example, the climate, like I told you earlier. In the Northern Hemisphere, our summers are in May, June, July. In Australia, winter peaks during these months. And then the eucalyptus tree sheds its bark rather than its leaves. And the marsupials, like the kangaroo, the platypus, they all fascinated and captured British and European imagination. So obviously, since your main reading public is going to be in Europe, is going to be in Britain, you are going to write about what is exotic in Australia so that you have a readership, so that your book sells. Now, with the passage of time, when the focus shifted to Australia itself, emphasis of the writers shifted as well. Then it was time to create a white Australian settler identity. Now, initially you were writing about what was exotic, what was bizarre, what would appeal to the European imagination. Then later on, attention shifted to Australia itself. That's when the focus of the writers shifted as well. Then they decided that Australia needed a white Australian settler identity. And then the myths of the Australian bush and the culture of bush life developed in a big way during this period. Now these days, currently, the interest of the reading public has expanded to include voices and points of view of previously ignored or marginalized peoples, such as the Aborigines, the immigrants, and women. Both the Australian nation, with its many cultural, political, and social aspects, and Australian literature, which in a sense is a vast body of writing that has been used to present some aspects of the nation and its sense of identity, have always and will continue to be constantly changing. Therefore, Australian literature may be defined as a term that is used to categorize a constantly changing body of writing. And this term involves the Aboriginal song sequence or folk tales, both in their early versions as well as English translations, the memoirs, journals, and the ballads of early European explorers and settlers, the more formalized works of written literature. So what we are saying is that it could include both the oral as well as the written tradition. Then when we talk of literature per se, then the ballads of the convicts, the bush songs, these belong to the era when Australian literature began to be an institution in itself. So early on, ballads and bush songs were part of an oral tradition. But in 1880, with the publication of the periodical The Sydney Bulletin, these became part of the written tradition. Now this was the time when writers consciously began to cultivate and develop the forms, themes and figures of the oral ballads and the bush songs. A.B. Banjo Paterson is one of the most popular and well-loved poets belonging to this school of writing. The popular bush ballad Waltzing Matilda, which is a ballad about a swagman who is a travelling farm worker in the Australian outback, has become in many senses the unofficial anthem, national anthem for many Australians of European descent. Now this popular ballad, what it does is it captures the spirit of surviving in a harsh alien landscape, and B, the pioneering spirit, C, the bold attitude to life as well as the authorities. Now how did literature develop in Australia? It took the form of the short story, as in other countries. It began as the short story, and the most famous and popular writers of short fiction were Henry Lawson and Barbara Bateson. Now, I'll be talking more about them when I deal with the Australian short fiction in another series of lectures. And let me just tell you that Henry Lawson and Barbara Bateson are the two authors who contributed majorly to the growth and development of the short story as a genre, particularly during the formative years. These authors were able to capture the various features of the growth of the Australian cultural myths, particularly those of the bush and its people. Lawson particularly deals with hardship in the bush, as does Barbara Bateson. Now the bush is a particularly Australian term used to refer to the Great Australian Outback, the vast interiors of Australia. Lawson and Bateson deal with the hardships that the European settlers and the people in the bush faced during the pioneering days in Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, during these early years, the writers were mainly of British origin. In other words, they were British or white settlers, and there was a kind of tension or a difference of opinion. So they had two schools of thought. One said you're supposed to follow and maintain British standards and traditions of great literatures. The other said Australia was different, so the umbilical cord needs to be cut off. Now both Australian and history and literature reveal this tension that has gone into making the Australian nation as we know it today. Now what were these tensions? One, it was British tradition versus Australian identity. Second, old country, the British metropolitan centres, colonial centres, versus the new country. Australia was a new country, and it was literally on the edges of the British Empire. Three was the tension and the confrontation between the white settlers and the Aboriginals. Then fourth was the tension that occurred between the early waves of settlers and the more recent immigrants. Then the tension of the old language, wherein you have images and literary forms of British literature, and the new idiom, where you have images and literary forms taking root in the new land of Australia. Now all these tensions were to contribute to the themes and forms of Australian literature. Now, the first half of the 20th century in Australia saw the development of the short story, and the second half that of the novel. Now, saw the development of poetry, and the second half saw the development of the novel. And great Australian poets who were canonized are A.D. Hope and Judith Wright, and among the novelists, Patrick White is their most popular, as well as their Nobel Prize winner. Now, the writings of these people moved away from the imitation of European literary forms to focus on the people, the mores, the customs, the traditions of the bush. And you also have a body of writers from among the hitherto marginalized group, which includes Aboriginal writers like Kath Walker, who is now known as Oodguru Nunakal, and Colin Johnson, who has taken on the name Mudruru Narugin, Kevin Gilbert, Sally Morgan. And these people are poets, novelists, dramatists, and short story writers. And the more recent trend that Aboriginal writing is going through is autobiography, the writing of autobiographies, biographies, and life stories. And then multiculturalism, both at the political level as well as in literature is another aspect of Australian literature as we find it today. Now, having said that by way of introduction, let us look at the land and history of Australia very, very quickly. Now, Australia is supposed to be part of the Gondwana landmass, which included the continents of Africa as well as Asia. And it was only when, the Gondwana landmass split that Australia formed a separate island continent. The first wave of the first Aboriginal settlers reached the land around 50,000 years ago. Captain James Cook landed at Botany Bay on April 29, 1770, and he claimed that territory for the British monarch King George III and named it New South Wales. In 1780, it was to become a penal colony, and in 1788, the first fleet carrying convicts landed at Sydney Cove under the governorship of Arthur Phillip. And then after New South Wales was founded, Tasmania was colonized 1825, then Western Australia was founded in 1829, South Australia 1836, Victoria in 1851, and Queensland in 1859. So altogether there were 6 colonies. All were separate and given powers of self-rule by the British Empire until 1901, when Australia became a federation. Now, 26th January 1988 was celebrated as known as the bicentenary celebrations in Australia, and it was a commemoration for the white settlers of British origin. For them, it signified 200 years of their stay in Australia. But in the words of Vijay Mishra and Bob Hodge, to the Aborigines, it, and I quote, commemorated a white invasion of Aboriginal lands and the destruction of so many Aboriginal people and their traditional way of life. So now what is celebrated? When we celebrate our Republic Day, which is 26th of January, Australia celebrates Australia Day or Foundation Day. But for the Aborigines, the original inhabitants of Australia, it is also marked as the Invasion Day. So on the one hand, you have the white settlers who tried to create the myths of national foundation and beginnings to justify their presence on the island continent. But for the Aborigines, it underscores the beginning of a history of violence, of loss, and the need to question those very myths of the Australian nation. Now, in 2000, there was a referendum in Australia, and the people were asked to vote and decide whether they still wanted to remain under the British Queen, and they chose to remain under the British Queen. Now, once the British came to Australia, which was in 1788, Australia was to see a period of dispossessions, diseases, and the destruction of indigenous cultures. As I told you before, Australia was defined by Captain Cook as Terra Nullis or Terra Australis Incognita, which means the land of Australia which was unknown. And Terra Nullis, as I said before, is empty land. All right. Now, the Aboriginals, the Aborigines, that is a term which includes more than 250 distinct tribes with their own customs, their own language, their own culture. They're not a homogeneous group. And it also includes the Torres Strait Islanders. Now, what we also have to remember is that the children of the Aboriginals and the Torres Strait Islanders were separated from their parents and their families. And the grounds on which they were separated was primarily the color of their skin. Now, what happened was, in the beginning, when white settlers came to Australia, Australia was an unknown territory, an unknown land for them. So not many women came on board, except for the ones who were convicted. As a result of which, the white settlers often took Aboriginal women as their concubines. Now, the product of that relationship came out with colors which classified them into half castes, quadroons, quarter castes, and so on, depending on the color of their skin. The lighter the skin, the quicker they were to be picked up and sent to foster parents. The darker they were put into reserves. Now, why was this done? In a sense, to wipe out and obliterate Aboriginal genes. They believed very firmly that Aboriginal identity, Aboriginal genes could be wiped out by intermixing, and or could be assimilated totally into white society. Now, when we look back, this is a very, very strong evidence of racial control as well as cultural genocide. And the other thing that needs to be kept in mind constantly is that all writings and history that dealt with Australia documented primarily the history of the white people in Australia, and not the history, not the culture, not the contribution of the Aboriginals. Now, let's look at how land and how it shaped the history of literature in Australia. Now, as I said earlier, that Australia was discovered by Captain Cook in 1770, but Dutch sailors had reached Australia in 1623. And the British explorer William Dampier had reached the west coast of Australia in 1688 itself. But it was in 1770 that Captain Cook came. Now, initially what they thought was trade and commerce. But when Captain Cook reported that, and I quote, "The country itself, so far as we know, doth not produce any one thing that can become an article in trade to invite Europeans to fix a settlement upon it." When he reported that this country does not seem to grow or produce anything that can be bartered, traded with, the focus shifted to making Australia a penal colony. Now, the convicts were transported for a little over half a century, and 150,000 men and women came to Australia in chains. Now, most of them were mainly illiterate peasants, workers, vagabonds, professional criminals, transported for thefts or crimes of violence against the person. But among them were a few English, Scots, Irish, Canadians transported for such gentlemen's crimes as forgery, embezzlement, or abduction. So on the one hand, you had the convicts coming in. Then a little later, you had the settlers coming in. And the settlers were primarily of two groups. One was the civil settlers, and the other was the military settlers who came to administer this new-founded colony. So written output initially was in the form of journals, letters, exposés. Then when the free settlers began to replace the convicts in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, and they discovered that the land could sustain sheep rearing, large holdings of land were devoted to the pastoral enterprises. And with the land being devoted to pastoral enterprise, what they hoped to do was export to the British textile industry. Then gold was discovered in 1851 near Bathurst, later on in Victoria, and later on at Queensland. So what happened as a result of the discovery of the gold mine was that till then, that time, only close to 50% of the population of Australia was of convict origin or descent. But with the gold rush, Australian colonies were to see both capital and labour from overseas. So this newfound prosperity, according to A. N. Turner, gave a sense of permanence to the occupation of the land. The startlingly rapid yet solid growth of colonial capitals provided a new pivot for colonial society, and then began the consolidation of the colonies in 2 phases. Now, one phase was the pastoralist who enjoyed a leisured lifestyle of the powerful landed rural rich, much as they did in England. And the second phase you had in the cities. Intellectual and professional pursuits began to flourish. Now, the only things that roused the settlers was the threat to their property interests from land reforms that would be passed from time to time in the Parliament. Nothing as such deterred them. So as a result of all the socio-cultural and socio-economic changes taking place, what happened was literacy increased. When literacy increased, the demand for popular literature increased along with it. The local reading audience was, however, of very small size, so they had to publish mostly in newspapers and periodicals, magazines. And if they wanted to publish their stories, their narratives, their novels in book form, they had to return to England or London. Now, this too was not such a big deal or a big issue, as most of the writers anyway were British born. And there was a larger market, a larger audience. So obviously they wrote about the exotic in Australian life and landscape. Now here, three prominent writers come to mind. One is Catherine Spence, who made the cities her themes occasionally. Two, Marcus Clarke, who wrote about the penal system. And three, Rolf Balterhood, who made the bush the setting of his work. By the 1890s, the concept of the Australian nationhood became more concrete, and the Australians began to think of the 6 colonies as one nation. So here, by the 1890s, you have the image of the nation emerging in the popular imagination of Australians. In 1898, the Australian Constitution was passed by referendum, and in a sense, since Australia was so far away and therefore distant from the mother country or from the old world, the umbilical cord became severed. So by the 1900s, the idea, most of the Australians were anyway now native born, and the movement for Australian Federation caught on. Now this too added a new dimension to the whole idea of nationalism. In 1900, the British Parliament passed an act to constitute the Commonwealth of Australia, and all the 6 colonies now became states and joined the Federation. In 1901, the Federal Constitution came into effect, and the first national election was held on May 9th. Now this was also the year of the White Australia policy. This meant that a legislation prohibited the permanent settlement by non-Europeans or people of non-European descent. By the 1900s, the publications scenario changed as well, as many of the writers were now born on Australian soil. Earlier the people who were writing were mostly those who had come as settlers to Australia, so they were British born. But now what was happening, by the 1900s, most of the writers were already born on Australian territory. So their works could now be published in the Bulletin and the Worker, and Angus and Robertson began publishing Australian works in 1895 with Banjo Paterson's The Man from Snowy River. So by this time, writers were now churning out narratives of adventure, humor, romance. Then the World War I broke out in 1914 and lasted for 4 years up to 1918. Now, a large number of Australians and New Zealanders were killed at Gallipoli when they fought under the British flag. Shortly after the First World War, and prior to the Second World War, around 1931, the world was faced with the Great Economic Depression, and this affected Australia also, as more than 1/3 of the Australian working force was unemployed. Shortly after that, World War II broke out, 1939, lasted till 1945, and the threat of war loomed even larger for Australia because it was very, very close to, geopolitically, it was very, very close to Japan, and Japan was a major threat. Now all these causes were important in the nation's formation of an identity, which was very, very different from Britain. World War II made the Australians realize that they were closer to and actually more a part of Asia than of the mother country. And then they also formed a close alliance with the United States of America. Then Vietnam War happened in 1965. Now all these events brought together various trends and heralded the repercussions they would have for the nation and its construction of a national identity. Then post-World War II, immigration from Southern Europe and Asia happened, which led to a multicultural paradigm of national consciousness and social policy. Now, while all this was happening on the national and the nation front, what was happening to and with the Aborigines? Let's take a look at that. All right. Now, most of the history that is written about Australia in the past has very often neglected the experiences, the contribution of the Aboriginal peoples, the women, and members of other ethnic or racial minorities. They have ignored the fact that the settler society was actually only the result of an invasion, of a white invasion and dispossession. Now, the Aborigines were not considered citizens of Australia, and their numbers, they were not even counted in the official census. It was always assumed that they were a part of the population that would become extinct very soon, or would be fully assimilated into white population. And then they also had a strict white Australian policy, which ensured that Asians would not be admitted into Australia. okay, or even allowed to settle down there in large numbers. So one of the early accounts, now that was one form of a history that was neglected by Australian history in the past. Aboriginal land, again, as I said, they had no property markers, they had no cultural markers. So what the white settlers did when they came in was take over their land, and then they formed their pastoral lands where there was grazing, cattle was introduced, and the Aboriginals had no access to their sacred grounds, to their corroboree grounds. So the Aboriginal land was taken away, often forcibly and violently, by the state governments without giving any compensation to the Aboriginals right from the time of the arrival of the settlers. And they were physically and violently removed from their land that they had roamed. Now you have to also remember that the Aboriginals were largely a nomadic people. So they would roam around, they knew where to gather food, they knew where to go for water, and they knew where their sacred sites were, their corroboree grounds were. So they could meet, they could perform their ceremonial rites, and they were not stopped by anybody. The land was theirs. But with the coming of the white settlers, and with them taking over the lands for their pastoral needs, for their homesteads, for cultivation, they began creating boundaries and fencing off property. So as a result of which, the nomadic Aboriginals could not travel across the land. Food became a problem for them. There were fences all over. They had no access to their corroboree grounds. And their children were forcibly taken away for adoption by white foster parents, or they were placed in reserves. And all this was done with the assimilation policy in mind, so that they could become a part of mainstream Australian culture and thinking. They were not given any land rights or titles. They could neither own nor till the land. And the government and policy makers argued that they were not advanced enough to be granted freehold land. Now, then the Aborigines themselves began to organize movements against the government, and this against particularly the assimilation policy in the 1950s and the 60s. And the movements for land rights and empowerment were led by leaders like Charles Perkin from the late 1960s onwards. So what happened was they had the social reform, greater civic rights, and a greater public awareness of Aboriginal issues was in a sense brought about. So on May 10th, 1962, national vote was given to the Aborigines. In 1962, the Institute for Aboriginal Studies was also established. In 1965, the establishment of the Aboriginal Welfare Conference was put into force. And in 1967, as late as 1967, a referendum granted citizenship rights for Aborigines, allowing them to be counted for the purpose of the national consensus. So till 1967, they were not a part of any official record. They had no citizenship rights, no land titles, nothing. But this created a very, very strong resistance movement. These decisions on the part of the government, and why that happened was because there was a lot of vested interest on the part of the state governments of Queensland and Western Australia, as well as from mining companies. And because they felt that ultimately if the land had to be returned to the Aborigines as a result of all these decisions, their economy would be affected in a very big way. But the Aborigines, despite all sorts of racial prejudices, have continued to fight for their ancestral land, and some have even taken recourse to legal action. And the watermark of the land rights movement was the Mabo Judgment of 1992. Now, in this, what happened is, till 1992, there had been no legal recognition of pre-existing rights of the indigenous people of Australia to their land or to their resources. The High Court's decision granted land title or claim to the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders in the Mabo Judgment. So this decision, in a sense, strengthened the legal position of the native title against action by the state and territory and governments. So what this judgment provided very firmly, and I quote, was against removal of the indigenous people from their land other than with their free and informed consent after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible with the option of return. So as a result of this, what happened was the Native Title Act of 1993 was enacted by the Australian Federal Parliament, and this recognized and protective native title to the land. Now this was significant in several ways. One, it corrected the general opinion that Australia did not belong to anybody before the coming of the white settlers. Two, it served as a beacon and a guide for any future cases that concern land rights, native land right, and compensation to the Aborigines. And three, it brought the issue of land ownership in Australia into sharp focus. All right. Now, in the beginning, when the early settlers came to Australia, the kind of images that they had of the land, the nature of the land, it influenced the course of settler history in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it also left a mark in the cultural consciousness of the new arrivals to the land. So the land became the most important, the most prominent thing against which the identity of the settlers could be constructed. So by the end of the 19th century, you had myths of the new land, which had taken literary shape in Australia in the writing of the early settlers. And the experience of the settlers, as I mentioned earlier, was published weekly in the Bulletin. And they all established the myths that linked the land to the early white settlers. Now, nowhere is the Aboriginal mentioned. Okay. Now, the Australian legend, it highlights the life of the shearers and migratory workforce of the Australian outback. And this legend found their way into the ballads and the stories that came up. The image of the traveling bushman, he became an idealized heroic figure, and he had the ability to transform the convict attitudes of disrespect for authority and crime into democratic and collective ideals that made him a cultural hero. Then later on, you had the pioneer legends, which focused on the life of the settlers, trying to come to terms with the land and claiming it as a part of their own. And this also incorporated women to some extent. Now, till now, women were absent from all forms of representation. But now, with the beginning of the pioneering legend, even though men were the chief focus, women to some extent were also incorporated in the literature. Then the early writers also had to invent ways of presenting the different environment and atmosphere of the island continents. The seasons were reversed. The flora and fauna was strange. And there's a very interesting quote from Marcus Clarke, where he's written in 1874. Marcus Clarke, as I told you, wrote about the penal system. He writes, "In Australia alone is to be found the grotesque, the weird, the strange scribblings of nature learning how to write. Some see beauty in our trees without shade, our flowers without perfume, our birds who cannot fly, and our beasts who have not yet learned to walk on all fours. But the dweller in the wilderness acknowledges the subtle charm of this fantastic land of monstrosities. The phantasmagoria of the wild dreamland called the bush interprets itself, and he begins to understand why free Yasu loved his heritage of desert sand better than all the bountiful richness of Egypt." And now, Henry Lawson had a very major hand in developing the popular image of the bush, and he celebrated the spirit of the white bush folk, but depicted the outback as very, very bleak, as full of hardships. Okay, and then you had the ballads of Bateson, which encouraged the construction of this opposition between the city and the bush, and the bush and its moors were seen as more authentically Australian than the city. And the Australian legends, bush lore, and the pioneer myths have all been open to criticism on the grounds that it was very, very sexist. And also that it did not really give you any picture of reality of contact between the settlers and the Aborigines. And then, of course, it does not represent the Australian identity in the now era of multiculturalism. So, what we're trying to say, in other words, is land and history of Australia are inseparably linked. And the connection of the two is actual as well as discursive, and the outcomes have been such that are political as well as socio-cultural, be it in the history, the laws, the legend, the way the land has been presented, all form a part and a context of Australian literature and Australian studies. Now, in the next lecture that we'll be doing, I'll be talking to you some more about the culture and the people of Australia. For now, what we have to remember is the land and the history of Australia are inextricably linked together, and it is important to read the discourses as they are presented, as well as to read between the lines and against the stated intention of their texts when we talk about any literature, and particularly in the case of Australian literature, since I'm talking about Australian literature today.